Hi, everybody. Good morning. How's everybody doing? Good. Thumbs up. My name is Deann Louise Nardo. I go by they, she, siya. I just want to introduce myself. My mother's side is from Bangar, La Union, and in the Philippines, and my father's side is from Umingan, Pangasinan, Philippines. Being a Generation 1.5 member of diaspora, I feel like I always had to choose between being Filipino or Canadian. But I want to start with a story. One day when I was back in the Philippines, my uncle took us on a fishing boat to an estuary. The waters were calm, and when we slowed down the boat, I could look over the side of it and see this clear line. One side was green and one side was blue, and it was where the river met the sea, what we called Sabangan. But as I looked under the surface, I noticed that it wasn't so cut and dry. As you know, nature doesn't have clear borders, and this was no exception. The blue and the green waters mixed together and coalesced, and it was this beautiful marbled amalgamation. This metaphor really helped me understand many things. It helped me make sense of my diasporic identity and even my non-binary gender identity. And until now, the poetry in nature helps me understand realities and reconnects me to the greater world. As a teenager, I moved around a lot, and my camera journals became my companion through all the depression and the moves. It was an outlet, and I was into punk and emo music and tried to get a hold of all the underground media and subculture, whether it be music, movies, and zines. I ended up putting together a zine called Controller in high school where I gathered most of my friends' works and turned it into a little zine that I Xeroxed myself and distributed at all the thrift stores, coffee shops, bookstores, and community organizations around Vancouver at the time. And this is where I first learned about community building and not having to wait for permission to make things happen. I've been making self-published zines ever since. And here are some of the examples, some poetry zines and photos, and yeah. So I want to talk about Kapwa. Kapwa, according to Professor Virgilio Enriquez, who is the founder of Filipino psychology, says that Kapwa is the recognition of a shared identity, an inner self shared with others. This Filipino linguistic unity of the self and the other is unique and unlike in most modern languages. Why? Because implied in such inclusiveness is a moral obligation to treat one another as equal fellow human beings. And Cup was something I didn't reclaim until I understood the gravity of what we've lost and how divide and conquer and disassociation from each other, from community, has been used for many generations of colonization in the Philippines. It was even more stark growing up in so-called Canada in this hyper-individualized colonial society. And I want to read something from Lenny Strobel. All cultural education must begin with the land. What are our cultural stories about the land? Our homeland of over 7,000 islands in the Pacific Ocean, this archipelago that used to be connected by land bridges to Southeast Asia. And what does decolonization have to do with our cultural stories? Decolonization is remembering or putting together the parts of the self that were fragmented, forgotten, and confused by the violence of colonial and imperial narratives. Decolonization is turning to counter narratives. If you're not who the colonizers say you are, then who are you? So, when you're pulled away from home, you become decontextualized, you're uprooted. And one way I started to reclaim my identity was through cultural things like food, dance, jewelry, textiles, tattoos. It made me realize the different ways art is seen in Western lens in the cold museums behind glass. But back home, art is connected to everyday life. Art to me became a return, a recontextualization, reclaiming what is considered art and how within community. It's a care practice, a place to name your ancestors and where you come from and are going, to restore yourself within a greater whole. So an example of a workshop that I put together is called Merienda Time, Collective Food Making and Snacking as Diaspora. And at the workshop, we made ginataang bilo-bilo, which is a Filipino snack dessert. We were snacking and talking. We rolled glutinous rice balls and we put it into dessert. And we posed questions together, like how does food connect to home and what is authenticity when thinking of cuisine and the perspective of diaspora? Another one that we put together is called Abel, Weaving Words in Wool. And it's a workshop where We combined writing prompts about ancestral connections as part of the diaspora, playing with pattern and asking, how do we tap into our inner resources and our lineages to make sense of our own mythologies while weaving these into embroidery hoops? So I facilitate workshops with a lot of different groups like migrant workers, queer BIPOC youth, and domestic workers. And all I'm doing is carving and co-creating an autonomous space with everybody. They are often not given the space to pause, slow down, and ask questions because of the oppressive power structures without. We are working within limitations. And these limitations are what we like to play with and subvert inside our co-created spaces. So whether it be making blackout poetry out of work contracts, disseminating government martial law propaganda through performance art, or self-publishing our own artworks through zine. And in these spaces we inhabit, we are open to ask questions and nurse nuance, strive towards accessibility. How do we spread resources to others and who is not in the room with us? Activism, reckoning with accountability against the systems that created the conditions in the first place. And we can imagine radically together, what would it be like without these oppressive systems? And being part of the diaspora is a state of impermanence and constant transformation. In parallel, art can be many disparate things. It can be confrontational, it can be an escape, it can be didactic, it can be abstract. So community art really is releasing art from a box and giving people the space to choose how to utilize art for themselves. It's a practice of reclaiming autonomy. So an example is something called Buhay Migrante, which is migrant life, literato at tula, photo and photography and poetry. And it was a project that set out to exhibit a slice of life of Filipino migrant workers in Quebec. This was done through poetry and photography workshops and submissions of their works. And we held an exhibit in Sherbrooke and Montreal, coinciding with December 18, which was the International Migrant Workers Day. They submitted photos that were organized in categories like work, portrait, food, still life, scenery, life, rest, and play. And then we compiled it into a zine with their poetry. Another one is Gintong Batas, Golden Rule, an exhibit I co-curated, seen through the eyes of young Filipino artists. The exhibit commemorated the 50th anniversary of the Philippine martial law, mainly through video recorded conversations with martial law survivors who fled the regime in the 70s and 80s to Canada. The results of the exchange between survivors and artists were reflected in art like music, AI, word art, performance art, food art, while the video recorded interviews were projected onto art installations throughout the exhibit. Kapit Bisig, Voices in the Frontlines was a project where we interviewed Filipino frontline workers and migrant workers and organizers in Montreal through COVID-19. About challenges, where to get support, help, and resources. And a part of Kapit Bisig, which means linked arms, and it was a mutual aid resource that popped up during the pandemic. And a last example is called Nandito Tayo. It's a project where artist Telekinesis and I joined with the organization Pinay Quebec to develop a project that is based on the collective memory and resilience of the large Filipino care worker community in Côte-des-Neiges. So we presented a sound and visual landscape to celebrate memories and stories of 8 people in the community. And we did it in 3 elements, like audio interviews with live drawings, community screen printing, where they actually screen printed each of their faces on the banners, and public presentations. One was at the Mackenzie Park forest. Yeah. And so community art and cultural work takes advantage of something art does well. It plays with context. And this helps with narrative reclamation and narrative building. Not only do we gain autonomy through creating our own narratives, these personal narratives can become part of historical archives as well, and we make our own footprints. And I want to end with this quote by Leanne Berasamasake Simpson. I believe in creating the change on the ground and creating the living alternatives. And it's as simple as that. You know, we don't need to ask for permission to create and live in the alternatives. Finding kapwa is finding yourself and each other, and it is remembering yourself within the community and finding the connections that lead us back to wholeness. Thank you.